Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history drifts softly into the quiet of night. In the shadows of post-World War II, as nations rebuilt and empires weakened, the world celebrated India's independence in 1947. Fireworks lit the skies, flags were raised, and a new nation was born. But beneath that joy lay a cost few could truly see. As many as 15 million people forced from their homes, and perhaps 2 million lives lost. Historians still debate the numbers. Some count 10 million displaced, others more, yet all agree partition became one of the largest human upheavals of the 20th century. Imagine trains groaning across the countryside, packed with refugees. Some arrived filled with weary survivors. Others rolled in silent, carrying only the weight of tragedy. This was not the triumph told in speeches and headlines. It was something else entirely, a sorrow hidden behind celebration. Tonight, as you sit by the fire, we'll gently uncover that other side of partition. The side history often sets aside. The human stories of loss, survival, and exile. And it begins with a deadline that came far sooner than anyone expected. If you find comfort in these journeys through history, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories to light. By the end of World War II, the British Empire was exhausted. India, long called the jewel in the crown, had become impossible to hold. The independence movement was surging, millions had marched under Gandhi's call for freedom, and Britain knew the colonial age was ending. But the question was not whether India would be free, it was whether India would be one nation or two. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, envisioned a united secular India where all religions could coexist. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, feared that in such a state, Muslims, nearly a quarter of the population, would be permanently outnumbered and politically marginalized. Jinnah argued for the two-nation theory, that Hindus and Muslims were not just communities, but separate nations, each requiring its own homeland. Britain, weary of governing and wary of further bloodshed, saw partition as the answer. It would grant India independence while also creating Pakistan as a separate Muslim-majority state. On paper, it looked like a solution, freedom for one, security for the other. In reality, it was a rushed fix that carried explosive consequences. Partition was seen as the fastest way to resolve Hindu-Muslim tensions and hand over power, but speed would soon prove disastrous. Why did independence arrive almost a year ahead of schedule, and why did that single decision upend millions of lives? The answer begins with Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last British Viceroy of India. Tasked in early 1947 with overseeing the transfer of power, originally set for June 1948, he shocked both Britain and India by announcing on June 3rd that independence would instead come on August 15th of that same year. What should have been a year-long transition collapsed into just over 10 weeks. On paper, it seemed bold and decisive. In reality, it stripped away the chance for careful planning altogether. Political leaders welcomed the news. To them, it meant momentum, the empire finally retreating, the freedom struggle finally victorious. Mountbatten cloaked the date in symbolism too. 15th August marked the second anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II, a triumph tied to his own naval career. But for ordinary people, the deadline landed like thunder. Entire towns suddenly faced the question: would they wake up in India or in Pakistan? Villages that had prayed side by side in temples, mosques, and gurdwaras for centuries now feared they might be split in two by morning. Imagine the disorientation. You walk into your local market, greet a neighbor you've known all your life, and then hear whispers that tomorrow your family might belong to another country altogether. You will not be asked. You will not vote. You may not even have time to pack before soldiers or officials tell you your fate. In 1947, this was no exercise in imagination. It was the lived reality of millions. Independence was celebrated in one breath, while the dread of exile filled the next. The absence of preparation is shocking even in hindsight. No refugee camps were ready, no supply chains built, no rail system staged to carry the desperate waves of people about to move. Troops were not mobilized to shield civilians from violence. The borders were drawn on paper, and then the people were left to survive or perish on their own. For countless families, independence arrived hand in hand with displacement. Farmers abandoned crops that would never be harvested. Generations left behind the homes their ancestors had built. Children were carried through train stations crammed with thousands, waiting for trains that sometimes never came. And when trains did arrive, some became rolling coffins, attacked by mobs hunting those who fled. Why was such enormous risk tolerated? For Britain, the calculation was cold. The empire, bled dry by the Second World War, no longer had the money, troops, or will to hold on. Officials feared that delay would cost resources, spark unrest, and further shred Britain's reputation. A swift exit, no matter the human cost, was deemed acceptable. Speed was valued above stability, retreat above responsibility. The result was the opposite of the clean break Mountbatten promised the world. The deadline planted the seeds of chaos, leaving civilians to pay for haste with their lives and homes. India and Pakistan celebrated independence with flags and speeches, but beneath the theatre lay a grim divide between leaders who claimed victory and ordinary people who endured catastrophe. And perhaps most ominously, that sudden deadline left barely 5 weeks for the border itself to be drawn. The fate of millions was about to rest in the hands of one man. A line would be carved across the map, but the question remained, swift for whom? In that whirlwind of deadlines, Britain turned to an unlikely figure, Cyril Radcliffe. A London lawyer who had never set foot in South Asia, knew nothing of its languages, faiths or histories, and had built his career arguing tax cases. Yet in July 1947, he was suddenly flown into Delhi and ordered to lead the boundary commissions that would decide where India ended and Pakistan began. His tools were not years of study or local wisdom, but a pile of outdated maps, census charts, and a deadline of just 5 weeks. Why Radcliffe? To British officials, his very ignorance was a virtue. He had no ties to Indian politics, no loyalties to Hindus, Muslims, or Sikhs, and no colonial record that could be accused of bias. They believed a fresh pair of neutral eyes would appear fairer than a seasoned administrator. More importantly, he was known in London as a quick legal mind who could deliver judgments under tight deadlines. For a government desperate to exit India swiftly and with minimal entanglement, Radcliffe seemed the perfect instrument, efficient, impartial on paper, and disposable once the task was done. Radcliffe was no geographer, no colonial expert, not even a man with experience outside Britain's courtrooms. Yet he was asked to divide a land of 300 million people into 2 nations. He was told to rule on sacred sites, trace borders across rivers and mountains he had never seen, and decide the fate of communities bound together by centuries of shared life, all without ever stepping into their villages. The data in front of him reduced humanity to numbers. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, marked in neat columns by district, as though entire provinces were uniform. But on the ground, especially in Punjab and Bengal, lives were braided together like threads in a single cloth. Muslim and Hindu families living on the same street, Sikhs sharing the same wells, markets, and harvests. None of that complexity could be found in census tables. So when Radcliffe's pencil traced across maps, it cut through families, fields, and shrines that had stood for generations. On paper, the logic seemed simple. Muslim-majority districts to Pakistan, Hindu and Sikh majorities to India. But real life defied arithmetic. In Punjab, farmers ploughed side by side regardless of faith. In Bengal, Hindus and Muslims traded on the same riverbanks and celebrated festivals together. To split these lives with a ruler and compass ignored the very fabric of coexistence. What looked like tidy lines in a report translated into heartbreak on the ground. Secrecy made it worse. Radcliffe worked behind closed doors, confiding only in a few advisors while the public remained in the dark. His rulings were locked away until independence had already been declared. On the 15th August 1947, crowds poured into the streets, flags waving, songs rising. Yet no one knew where the border lay. The Radcliffe line was not revealed until 17th August, 2 days later. Only then did millions discover which country they belonged to. The shock was crushing. Imagine rejoicing for freedom on Friday, only to be told on Sunday that your ancestral home now belonged to another nation. One family found their village on the Indian side, while relatives just down the road were suddenly Pakistani citizens. Overnight, ties of kinship dissolved into desperate questions. Do we stay? Do we flee? Where can we be safe? Rumours travelled faster than official news, and hesitation itself could mean death. Radcliffe himself reportedly understood the devastation his work would bring. But, bound by the deadline, there was no time for careful transitions, no provisions for humane passage. What looked efficient in London triggered chaos in Punjab and Bengal. Communities were uprooted, not by soldiers on the ground, but by the stroke of a pen wielded far away. And when the line was finally announced, millions faced an impossible choice: stay in the homes their ancestors had built, or abandon everything for the uncertain promise of safety on the other side. For many, the choice came too late. What followed was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Overnight, towns and villages where Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs had lived together for centuries turned hostile. Neighbours who once shared food and festivals now looked at each other with suspicion. A single line on a map had redrawn identities, and in barely a year, some 14 to 15 million people were uprooted, creating a tide of human movement the subcontinent had never seen. The familiar rhythms of daily life collapsed. Borrowing sugar from the family next door, planting in the same fields or worshipping side by side, all suddenly carried risk if that neighbour was now marked as belonging to the other side. Fear seeped into every household. Families whispered about rumours of mobs, weighed survival against loyalty, and faced impossible choices: abandon everything and flee, or stay and hope to withstand the violence pressing closer each day. For those who fled, the trains became symbols of both salvation and terror. Station platforms overflowed with families clutching bundles, pressing into carriages already bursting with people. Some trains managed to deliver their passengers battered but alive, survivors stumbling out hungry, thirsty and dazed. Others arrived in silence, carrying nothing but corpses. Mobs often ambushed trains along the tracks, attacking passengers with knives, fire and guns. Survivors remembered waiting in Amritsar as a train from Lahore pulled in, its windows dark, its carriages piled with the dead. Partition wasn't just a migration, it was a civil war breaking out in the shadows of independence. The violence was especially devastating for women. Around 100,000 were abducted during the chaos, assaulted, forced into marriage, or trafficked as spoils of war. Their bodies became weapons in a campaign of humiliation, meant to scar entire communities. Families, paralyzed by terror, sometimes turned to unthinkable measures against their own daughters and sisters to prevent such fates. These tragedies left scars no official record could ever count, and silence often replaced testimony. Stories whispered only in fragments to the generations that followed. Those who survived the journeys often found themselves in refugee camps. More than 600 spread across India and Pakistan. None were ready. Schools, fields, mosques and temples were turned into makeshift shelters. Families huddled under tents or bare roofs, waiting hours for food or water that rarely arrived. Disease spread quickly. Children played in dust beside endless queues of the displaced, their laughter colliding with the sobs of grief. For many, these camps became prisons of waiting. Return impossible, survival uncertain. Even objects carried stories of rupture. Families clutched wedding photos, land deeds, or small jewelry boxes while leaving behind homes, fields, livestock, and ancestral graves. Every abandoned orchard and empty courtyard stood as evidence that partition was not just about maps, but about roots torn from the earth. Even sacred places were lost. In Punjab, India's northwest frontier with Pakistan, and the epicenter of partition's bloodshed, Sikhs who had prayed for generations at their gurdwaras, Sikh places of worship where the Guru Granth Sahib is read and sung, suddenly found them across a border, visible only from a distance. These were not temporary absences. They were permanent losses. Independence had promised freedom and pride, yet for millions it delivered fear and dispossession. A safe homeland too often meant riots, hostility, or the misery of overcrowded camps. Safety, people realized, existed nowhere, not in the villages left behind, not on the rails, and not even across the frontier. And the exodus was only part of the tragedy. The collapse of trust and the waves of vengeance that followed would erase entire communities, leaving scars far deeper than displacement itself. Partition did not just uproot people, it erased entire communities. In Punjab, villages once alive with harvests, music and prayer were emptied in days, burned until only rubble and silence remained. In Bengal, flames tore through crowded neighborhoods, leaving nothing but blackened walls and scattered belongings. These were not random bursts of chaos, but calculated waves of violence that shattered centuries of shared life in hours. The patterns reveal intent. Families who had traded in the same markets and ploughed the same fields suddenly saw one another as enemies. Rumors spread faster than truth, sparking retaliation before facts could catch up. A massacre in one village ignited revenge in the next, the cycle spiraling beyond the reach of leaders or police. In some places, the killings were systematic. Armed groups, local militias, young men, even veterans of World War II, mobilized by landlords or community leaders to target specific religious groups. This gave the violence a chilling precision. For those living through it, terror arrived before it was visible. Survivors recall footsteps in the dark, shouts on the wind, or the clang of bells from villages already burning. Doors were barred. Families hid in fields, riverbeds, or cellars, praying the mobs would pass. Some sought safety in temples, mosques, or gurdwaras, Sikh places of worship. But even holy spaces were not always spared. Raiders dragged people from hiding, livestock was slaughtered or stolen, and towns vanished beneath the flames. Measuring the human cost is nearly impossible. Estimates of the dead range from several 100,000 to 2 million. A post-partition census recorded more than 2 million people missing in Punjab alone. Behind the numbers were farmers, craftsmen, teachers, children, entire families extinguished in days. Alongside the killings, sexual violence became a weapon of war. Around 100,000 women were raped or abducted, their bodies used to terrorize entire communities. Many of these stories were buried in silence, too painful for survivors to pass on. The devastation extended beyond bodies. Shrines, temples, mosques, and graveyards were looted or destroyed, as though memory itself was being erased. Yet not all humanity vanished. In one village emptied of its Muslim families, Sikh and Hindu residents continued to care for their neighbors' graves, small acts of remembrance amid the ruin. The scars endured long after the killing stopped. Survivors often carried their memories in silence, refusing to tell children of the homes, orchards, and relatives they had lost. In diaspora communities, partition surfaced in fragments. A half-told story, a photo of a vanished house, a name whispered but never explained. Silence became its own inheritance. Partition was never just about redrawing state lines. It was the obliteration of neighborhoods where languages, faiths, and traditions had blended for centuries. Independence created two nations, but at the price of tearing out pieces of society that could never be replaced. And though the mass killings slowed, the mistrust seeded in 1947 did not fade. It lingered, resurfacing in new forms for decades to come. The question that remains, did partition mark an end, or the beginning of something even more enduring? The violence of 1947 did not end with migration and massacres. The rushed partition created disputes that would shape South Asia for generations. nowhere more than in Kashmir, a mountainous frontier in the far north, wedged between India, Pakistan, and China. There, a Hindu Maharaja, Hari Singh, ruled over a largely Muslim population. When tribal militias crossed from Pakistan in October 1947, Singh turned to India for military aid. In return, he signed the Instrument of Accession, a legal pact binding his princely state to India in exchange for protection. The decision, coupled with Kashmir's mixed demography, ignited the first war between India and Pakistan within months of independence. By early 1949, a UN ceasefire left the territory divided, a temporary solution that hardened into one of the world's most dangerous fault lines. Kashmir was not the only fracture left by partition. Pakistan itself was split into east and west, separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Religion was the only thread binding them. Culture, language, and politics were worlds apart. Those cracks widened into crisis in 1971, when repression in East Pakistan erupted into civil war. Millions fled to India, and when India intervened, Pakistan's army was crushed. Bangladesh was born. Within 25 years, the Pakistan imagined in 1947 had fractured into 3 nations, another legacy of hurried decisions. The mistrust, seeded in 1947, fueled repeated wars. India and Pakistan clashed again in 1965, and later in 1999 at Kargil, a rugged Himalayan district in Kashmir near the line of control, where soldiers fought on frozen ridges more than 14,000 feet above sea level. Even ceasefires could not erase suspicion. Both militaries treated the other as an existential threat, funneling resources into defense. By 1974, India had tested nuclear weapons. Pakistan followed in 1998. A hurriedly drawn border now carried the possibility of nuclear war. Cold War rivalries sharpened the divide. Pakistan leaned toward the United States, India toward the Soviet Union. Arms, aid, and alliances deepened mistrust. These choices were more than strategy. They grew from the insecurity of 1947, when the map left millions displaced and both nations uncertain of their survival. Even today, partition's shadow lingers. In 2019, India revoked Article 370 of its constitution, stripping Jammu and Kashmir of its special autonomy, sparking protests, lockdowns, and renewed tension. Communal violence within India continues as well, smaller than in 1947, but proof that old dividing lines never disappeared. At the Wagah border, where Indian and Pakistani soldiers lower their flags each evening in a perfectly mirrored ceremony, crowds roar with pride. To outsiders, it looks like pageantry. To those who know the history, it is ritual born of mistrust, a daily reminder that the optimism of independence has long been shadowed by confrontation. Looking across these decades, the hurried decisions of 1947 did more than redraw a map. They lit the fuse for wars, created Bangladesh, and set 2 nuclear powers in permanent rivalry. And while these are the stories of states and armies, they grow from the same rupture that once turned neighbors into enemies and families into refugees. Independence in 1947 brought flags, parades, and speeches. Yet for millions, it meant losing homes, neighbors, and ways of life to decisions made in distant rooms. What appeared as freedom for nations quickly became loss for families, an erasure of identity, community, and homeland in the space of weeks. A rushed political fix produced a humanitarian disaster, borders drawn in haste, lives scattered in silence, and generations left to rebuild from the ruins. Those borders remain, but their deepest legacy is memory. Songs once shared, silences at dinner tables, and family stories passed down in fragments. Even today, partition lives on in the quiet spaces between generations. As we close tonight's story, let us remember that history is not just battles and treaties. It is the lives of ordinary people caught in their wake. If your family lived through partition, we invite you to share a memory below. We read every word with care, and if you wish to join us for more journeys through history told softly into the night, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until the next exhausting story, good night.